Hi, I've got some exciting or an exciting new project that we're doing to present from Roger Schmitz and Phil Patterson and I. We got some data we'll present that Philip and I are putting into a manuscript to be published, and it comes out of a hypothesis paper published last year called "Critical Oxygenation: Can Muscle Oxidation Forms About Critical Power?" The idea being muscle oxygenation dynamics, the slope of muscle oxygenation has something can inform us about critical power or sustainable performance. Um, and we're basically using that signal to generate a new tool to help athletes and coaches called critical oxygenation profile. Now, this is by no means an idea that's new or that we came up in. We're piggybacking on lots of different people here, especially Brett Kirby from Nike, who's presented at the Moxie Summit on numerous occasions. And he actually, in the same year, he published a paper with the title here, "Balance of Muscle Oxygen Supply and Demand Reveals Critical Metabolic Rate to Predict Time to Exhaustion." Instead of critical oxygenation, they're calling this thing critical metabolic rate. It's also based on the near signal and changes the muscle oxygen saturation slope. So, and they actually have some nice empirical data, which is going to help us understand what we're talking about to explain the data we're going to show later. So, what Kirby and colleagues showed was that the change in slope, so basically the slope of your muscle oxygenation, is going to determine your time to exhaustion. So the steeper the slope, the earlier the time to exhaustion is going to happen, or the flatter the slope, the later that's going to happen. Okay. And saying that basically the steeper the slope, the higher your percent of critical velocity, and the flatter the slope, the closer you are at critical velocity. It's kind of the two main takeaways. Now, what's important here is that essentially intensity is a function of, or muscle oxygenation slope is a function of the intensity output that you're demanding. So speed or power or whatever. Now they did this through identification of two specific slope of two specific slopes that they analyzed. And the first is you have one sec here. You have something like an initial slope. So you have an initial drop of muscle oxygenation, let's say somewhat regardless of the intensity you're starting at. And then if you're continue on doing moderate, heavier, severe intensity in the intensity domains, it's gonna the slope that follows. So after the initial slope, the delayed slope that follows is going to be in response to the intensity of exercise that you do. So if you do severe exercise where you're over critical power, you will only generate a negative slope, which you see at the bottom here. And if you're doing heavy or moderate where you're below critical power, you're going to generate some kind of a positive slope. Okay. On the right here, we'll actually see it a little better, where they do 3 different time trials, 5 minutes, 10, and 15-minute time trials, if I'm right, if I have that right. And we see the data. So all these intensities are in the severe domain, so they're all over critical power. And we have this initial drop, the initial slope, and then we have the delayed slopes. And the delayed slopes are in response to how intense the exercise is. So if you're doing a 5-minute time trial, the intensity rate's going to be much higher than a 15-minute, so the slope is much steeper than the 15-minute trial. So I hope that makes sense with these two slopes, the initial slope and the delayed slope. Now this observation that Near's dynamics of the muscle oxygenation slope is a function of intensity isn't anything new. So this is a 2000 study doing knee extensions, and they basically show very similar data with fascial lateralis, rectus femoris muscle at 20, 30, and 40% of MVC, and you see how slope changes as a function of the intensity that we're going at. Just to point out that this is something, again, not new, that we're specifically doing, but lots of groups have been doing it, and the observations have been made for quite a long time. So what we went on did is we got a Swiss professional football team, professional soccer team. We got 12 of their players, and they did intermittent step test protocols. So they would do a continuous performance output followed by a break, followed by performance output at a higher level, followed by a break until exhaustion. This is like a 3-1 test or a 5-1 test that the Moxie users might know. And these were 3-minute steps. And we had muscle oxygen saturation devices, so Moxie monitors on 6 muscle sites, quad, hamstring, and the calf. And we did some blood lactate sampling just to verify some data. And this is an example of one athlete, and this is the left gastroc. Okay. And what we have here is this raw data signal, right? With 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. 6 steps. At 6 steps, they voluntarily exhausted. And we always have these peaks, which are the breaks, the 2 black lines indicating the time of the breaks. And what we see is, if we look closely, is that we always have this initial slope and then a delayed slope when we do regression. So if you see these colored lines on the blue data, those are regression slopes. So we always have initial slope, delayed slope, initial slope, delayed slope, initial slope, delayed slope. And we then did is we plotted the delayed slope versus performance over here. And this is like our critical oxygenation profile. This is the visual that we would expect. We have speed and we have muscle oxygenation slope. And what we see, the purple line is lactate. We can look at that after. What we see is that essentially the higher the speed, the more slope decrease, and it goes from positive to negative. And we're going to ignore this last point right here, or the very point where at the very beginning of a test and the very end of a test, you can get points that don't match up. But generally speaking, you have a linear relationship between performance and slope. So this is a 0.99 0.99 r squared. So essentially, it's a perfect line. And maybe to the point why we're moving these points. So once you get to very low muscle oxygenation values like we have here, you can't go any lower. The signal just flats out. So there's no point in adding those. And at the very beginning, you can sometimes have a little bit of funky data, or where you get kind of flat lines at the beginning because there's no cardiovascular response if intensity is too low. So we ignore those as well. And this is to speed, but you can do the whole same thing to SMO2. You can plot it against SMO2. Basically, the higher the intensity, the steeper the slope, the lower your muscle oxygen averages get for those delayed slopes, right? So you kind of get the same profile. We can then extrapolate out are the intercepts, right? Where are we hitting the zero slope? So we're hitting zero slope at speed of 11.4 kilometers an hour and a muscle oxygenation value of 34.8, so 35%. The assumption would be that this zero slope is something like critical power. I prefer to call it something like sustainable performance. It's kind of the same thing, but so this linearity itself is what we find very interesting. Okay, and what's interesting then is if we look at the other muscle sites, because we took multiple muscle sites, so we could go to the quad, and we have the right quad and the left quad, and we can do the same things with the profile. And what we get is, again, we get this linearity with pretty good, again, 0.99, 0.94. We get nice linear functions, and the intercepts here being at 11.5 and here at 12. The intercept from the gastroc, if we quickly go back, was at 11.4. So these intercepts are kind of happening, again, this right, left leg or gastroc all at the same speed. So you're going to have a global effect across the muscles where you're able to maintain this critical oxygenation value or maintain oxygen supply and demand. What we don't have exactly the same here with the right and the left leg is where the intercept's happening for absolute SMO2. And we kind of see that in the raw signal with the left leg having much higher SMO2 than the right leg, which is interesting. So again, placement being somewhat relevant here if we're going to go with a value rather than just the slope data. And then last would be, for example, the right and the left hamstring. Again, we have the raw signals here. We don't have quite as good linearity here. Hamstrings are always a little bit harder, also just to get a good signal from. We get something like 0.84, 0.9, where we also, like, for example, in this hamstring, we removed from the analysis the last point, as we did with all of them, but we also these flattening out points. So it only ends up being, I think, the first 4 points are in the analysis here. So to clean that up a bit, but the intercepts end up being at 11.1 and 11.9. So the intercepts between all 4 muscles, if we take its speed, is between 11 and 12. So one kilometer difference. Of course, that's going to be relevant for absolute performance. But if you've taken all muscles across, the variability of the data and of basically the low resolution of the steps, I think we think this is a pretty good indicator that there is something like a critical intensity going on that's being reflected by all the muscles. Here, the right and the left leg themselves again have somewhat of a difference, 35 and 24% in the profile. Maybe the last point here we can go back and look at is that what happens is once you go below, so let's say above critical oxygenation, once you start getting negative slopes, that's also where lactate starts accumulating, which is what we see, right? If we have our intercept right here, basically after the intercept, lactate starts exponentially accumulating, which is associated often then with unsustainable performance. So that's what we would expect. Now, if we kind of take this data and we go through all 12 players, we can look at means for these blocks plots. And what we see is that if you take this critical speed, these intercepts over all the different muscle groups for all the athletes, you get no significant differences for the speeds. So every muscle you choose, the intercept's going to happen at a very, very similar place. Again, indicating that there is something like critical speed going on here that has effect on all the muscles in a similar way. If you look at the critical oxygenation, so this would be the absolute SMO2 value, you actually see that the right and left leg in overall situations, you actually end up having the same oxygenation value. It's actually the same in the quad and in the hamstring. Hamstrings within each other, but also between the quad and the hamstring. The example we showed before, we would say, well, that's obviously not the case for right and left leg. In that person individually, not the case. In means, it does seem to be the case. So for a lot of the athletes, you do have the same value right and left, but not in all the athletes. It's always the case. Interesting is that actually it's the gastroc right and left that show the most difference between right and left over the entire group. I'm not quite sure why that is. Again, we have a few outliers here, but generally that fits pretty good. I find this profile back here extremely interesting because it really pulls on this dynamic, this idea that the slopes of SMO2 are the relevant point, and finding out something about stability through an SMO2 slope of 0, which is what, for example, the Kirby et al. Paper is identifying as critical power. I think this is a useful tool to do very, say, low resolution testing. You just do a quick test, 3-1 test, run through this profile, extrapolate back and find out something like where am I guessing my sustainable performance is at. Now, the goal isn't then to use this as an absolute. The goal would then be you have a Moxy monitor, hopefully, or you have a NIRS device, hopefully. You can actually then go into training, run some time trials, and see what happens at the performance level, where you're supposed to have your sustainable performance, maximal sustainable performance, and you run that for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, and see, well, can I run my performance at there? Yes or not? Is this sustainable or not? And it should be. What it means, though, is if you're running this 5, 10, 20 minutes, and you see that as you progress through the training that you do end up establishing, for example, some negative slope over time, then maybe you're overestimating that point. It could also be that it's underestimating. It could be that if you give your body more time, so more than 3 minutes to adjust, that you actually do find zero slope, a steady state, which means you've underestimated that point. But it's giving you something to key in on for sure. And the better you know yourself, the tighter you can make these, let's say in the 3-1 test, the steps. These steps are pretty big, right? They're going from whatever, it's like 9 kilometers an hour up to 20 for some people. So it's a big performance range. If I know that this athlete's is at, what do we say, 11.4, you can fine tune that. You can go between 10 and 13 and do much more gradual steps to try to fine tune this linear relationship, because the points that are way out of bounds, right, way up of here, or points that are way low here, they don't fit into this linear relationship. So you want to fine tune this linear relationship by finding more points that are in this critical area right here. Most of the important ones are probably the ones just below. Those are going to give you better resolution. So working at something like 11.4, right, and then 12, 12.5, 13, or maybe 11, 11.5, 12, 13, 13.5, and really trying to fill in these points and see where that intercept starts happening. So this is a pretty long video, but I think it's an interesting concept. So hopefully people can sit through this. But I'm explaining this again today. I'm actually doing a podcast with Sean Seal about this. He did the test on this for Moxie users in the forum. I asked some people to send me some data. I've got a couple, but Sean sent me some data. So we're going to go over his data. I did an analysis. So maybe that's more entertaining to look at. So you can watch his podcast otherwise. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. And send me some critical auctionation data on the Moxie forum. Thanks. Bye.